Hello and welcome to The Internationalist, a weekly show from the Progressive International. I'm Varsha Gandikota-Nalitla from the PI Secretariat, and I'm hosting the second episode of the show, bringing you news from the front of our struggles around the world. We launched The Internationalist earlier this week with a discussion on the Make Amazon Pay campaign, where warehouse workers, climate activists, and citizens around the world taking on the world's richest man, Jeff Bezos, and the multinational corporation behind him. A shout out to all of our partners in this campaign and the 400 parliamentarians from around 34 countries who have pledged to stand with that movement in an open letter released just yesterday. You can follow the campaign at makeamazonpay.com, donate to the strike fund in support of Amazon's workers, and push your local representatives to make Amazon pay in your countries. Today's episode is called Intimacy and Internationalism, Learning from Feminist Movements. I'm calling in today from India, where just a few weeks ago, Hindu nationalists pushed through something called the Love Jihad law, violating women's rights to choose their partner in an Islamophobic attempt to prohibit interfaith marriages. Just last month, we saw the Polish government restrict access to abortion in the name of the church and national honor. This idea of linking women to national identities is not new. And as feminists throughout history, our struggles have inevitably forced us to reimagine and redefine how we're perceived. Abortion debates restrict our bodies, institutions of marriage regulate love, stigmas curtail pleasure, and unpaid labor limits leisure. These questions that feminism asks are intimate ones, but often we tend to think of intimacy as being necessarily tied to proximity, which makes the process of understanding and sharing with those far removed from us quite challenging. But seen another way, this can also be said about all struggles. Oppression is intimate, and so is our resistance to it. And it's precisely the fact that feminist movements have reckoned with this question for some time now that makes this conversation crucial and of urgent importance to any internationalist. I'm joined today by two incredible guests, and we'll be discussing how, as internationalists who are invested in overcoming these challenges of proximity, we can learn from the history of feminist movements. My first guest is Dilar Tariq, who is a political sociologist and activist of the Kurdish women's movement in Europe. She's currently based at the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford as a postdoctoral researcher. And her forthcoming book, The Kurdish Women's Movement, History, Theory, and Practice, will be published next year. Welcome to the show, Dilar. And my next guest is Lynn Segal. My next guest is Lynn Segal, who is Emeritus Anniversary Professor at the University of London in Psychological Studies, Psychosocial Studies, writing widely on feminism, gender, aging, and political activism. She's the author of many books, and I'm going to try and list a few here. Life and Politics, Out of Time, The Pleasures and Perils of Aging, Radical Happiness, Moments of Collective Joy, and most recently, The Care Manifesto. Unfortunately, our third guest, Professor Jamila Ribeiro, could not make it today due to a health emergency. We send her love and hope that we can bring her on into the Internationalist at another point again soon. Dilar and Lynn, welcome to the Internationalist, and thank you for being my guest today. I want to turn to you, Dilar, as we start off the show for an important reason. Before we can begin to discuss what to learn from a history of feminist movements, I would question how we learn, whose history we read, and well into the present day, whose experiences are considered knowledge and not. And you've written before about Kurdish women's experiences of several forms of violence and erasure as a result of being denied the processes of writing history, right? And the Kurdish women's movement is, of course, at the center of the revolutionary project of Rojava. And a lot is often said about what Rojava means for women, what it means for feminist movements, what it means for other revolutionary movements. But I want to flip that and hear from you on how the entire project itself finds its roots in the work of women's liberation. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Varsha. It's really an honor to be here with you and Lynn. And unfortunately, Jamila cannot make it, but as you mentioned, we send her love. I really appreciate this whole effort, and I hope these kinds of conversations really bring us closer to the aim of liberation, and they don't just remain as conversations, but actually can lead to common struggles. And I want to talk about that a little bit later on. But as you rightfully say, the project of the revolution in Rojava and also in different parts of Kurdistan is very much centering women's liberation through autonomy as one of the three main pillars of its freedom paradigm, the other two being radical democracy and ecology. Of course, many of the people who are listening now, and this is also, of course, I know some of the work that Progressive International is doing, is to raise awareness and actively struggle against the climate emergency. And we understand better and better every day that actually the systems that are supposedly claiming, that are claiming to give us the rights and protections and the liberties that we are aspiring towards are actually not just failing, but they are designed to fail. So at the heart of the Kurdish Women's Liberation Movement's project is actually a deep critique of the state and all kinds of other forms of power and oppression that actually hold entire society hostage. So in our perspective, and this is something that is very explicitly manifested in the revolution in Rojava, there cannot be a free society without women's liberation. And that's precisely because we understand that we need to start with the oppression in the most intimate sphere, in the family and in our own communities, in order to be able to play a broader role in the liberation of the world. So the struggle really has this kind of scale, from the family home to the liberation of the region and the Kurdish people in the region, but also on a global scale. What kind of role and mission can we play for the struggle against ecocide, against occupation, against militarism, and so on? And really, at the heart of this ideology and practice is putting women's liberation at the heart. And that's not only because women constitute the oppressed among the oppressed Kurdish people, for example, and also the Kurdish people in the context of the Middle East, of course, are often described as a destabilizing force. But we believe that with the solution of the Kurdish question, actually the wider region can also democratize. And but that, of course, comes down to the ways in which we struggle. So, of course, when the Kurdish women's movement over the last 40 years first began to form, it also learned a lot from international struggles around the world. Among the examples that were always kind of discussed were struggles, especially in the global south, on the African continent, in different parts of Asia, in Latin America, and also in Europe. How have women participated in revolutionary processes, and how have they often been sidelined? How have they been pushed back? And this, in the analysis of the Kurdish women's movement over these decades in this literature, it's often said that it is not possible to expect some kind of general liberation of society and then women's rights and labor rights and young people's rights and minorities and so on will be resolved. No. From the very beginning, we have to begin establishing our free institutions within our communities in the here and now. And this is how today also the Kurdish women's movement analyzes the concept of revolution. So against this very patriarchal understanding of revolution as something that will come one day and will be a chaotic process of reorganizing and socially engineering a new society, we think we have this kind of slow radicalism in the Kurdish freedom movement, in which mainly also drawing on the ideas of Abdullah Öcalan, who has been imprisoned after being abducted by a NATO-led conspiracy in 1999, that without the liberation of women, we cannot expect there to be a free Kurdish society that is worth living in, if we do not have free social relations within our own communities. So the women's liberation struggle is organized in the Kurdish women's movement in a very systematic manner. It's not something that is just assumed to exist, that women don't necessarily have this kind of liberationist consciousness. It is also something that needs to actively be developed and organized. So a lot of the work of the Kurdish movement in Kurdistan and also in Europe and in different parts of the world in which Kurdish people live, also diaspora communities, is to have parallel to this democratic confederal system that is being built up in Rojava explicitly through the work of communes and assemblies and cooperatives and all kinds of different mechanisms to make the society an inclusive and egalitarian one, with all of its contradictions, of course, because it requires a lot of labor to overcome oppression that is thousands of years old. But parallel to that, we have an autonomous women's system, which means that next to each commune or each assembly that the movement builds, there has to be an autonomous women's structure that can veto the general decisions where also women take place, but there is also parallel like autonomous women's system. And the mixed structures cannot interfere with the women's movement's decisions. We have several principles like the co-presidency principle, which shares power between women and men. And we have these kinds of incentives to kind of really encourage women's perspective on politics, on the economy and everything. But we need these kinds of autonomous spaces also for women to have a space amongst themselves for criticism and self-criticism, to develop themselves outside of this patriarchal gaze. So at the heart of this kind of project is also an internationalist vision, of course, because we believe that at the moment in the 21st century, and we've seen it in the past as well, and today actually we see that the women's movements around the world, alongside also, I would have to say, definitely climate justice actions, especially with young people and many young women at the forefront of this. Women's struggles really are the biggest social movements in the world today. We've seen it on the 8th March kind of rallies this year, last year, and so on. They are transnational, they're horizontally organized, and they demand a different kind of approach and radical perspective on the way society needs to be run. And this, I would say, is also happening parallel to a process in which these very liberal feminist ideas, very individualistic forms of understanding freedom, are entering the mainstream, and we're bombarded with all of these celebrities and rich women and heads of states claiming to be feminists while they are actively suppressing liberation struggles of women elsewhere. So there needs to also come this kind of critique of liberal feminism and its relationship to the state, and how that actually undermines what we mean by having to build this confederal women's system. So in our approach, not only is the Kurdish women's movement in Rojava, for example, unified under an umbrella which unites all of the assemblies and communes, we also have a similar structure inside Turkey and in other parts of Kurdistan that have umbrella structures. We have umbrella movements in Europe, and we kind of organize within the Kurdish women's movement through a confederal system to ensure accountability and democracy in our own structures as we struggle against some of the very, very major attacks that some of the people who are watching right now will know. The Turkish state's invasions and occupation attempts on Rojava, the fact that hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced, the fact that Turkey is the largest prison for political women prisoners in the world, and all of the specific political femicides that the Turkish state is currently committing against the Kurdish women's movement. So against that, we're saying we also need a women's world democratic confederalism, which basically means that we don't want another kind of international women's organization. There's so many of them and they're doing all this amazing and great work, but we need to actually move beyond the idea of solidarity. This has been consistently said in all of the statements of the Kurdish women's movement in the last few years, that we need now vocabularies and platforms for common struggle. That today, after so many people have witnessed the Kurdish women's movement's fight against the so-called Islamic State and its resistance against the Turkish state, and also patriarchy in its own community, today is also the time for women and feminists around the world to defend the women's revolution in Rojava, because the women's revolution is not something that is just a day in the calendar that upsets all social relations. It's something that seeks sustainable, free societies in which women can be happy and joyful and rightful history makers again. So this is actually what is at stake. We see that today around the world, women are not only just struggling for more rights anymore. They are having to fight to protect what they have already been fighting for hundreds of years. And the fact that the second largest NATO army, the fact that European weapons, the fact that the same companies that are also responsible for ecocide in many parts of the world are in fact the same forces that either finance or are somehow complicit through their provision of technologies or arms and money and funding, or just their mere silence. They are complicit in the destruction of this very promising emancipatory women's liberationist project in Rojava. So we say now it's the time for women also to defend Rojava. We have an ongoing campaign for that. And what I want to stress here is that really that's in this kind of 21st century where we see on a daily basis women from India to Brazil, from Kurdistan to Canada, people are struggling against femicide, and we see specific targeted attacks against politically active women. We know the case of Mariela Franco, Berta Cáceres. We know that just this summer, 3 Kurdish women activists were killed by a Turkish drone strike in the city of Kobani, which of course many people will know as the city in which women first defeated ISIS. So this is what is at stake, and I think coming up with new terms, with new vocabularies in which we define also fascism, for example, from a woman's perspective, in which we come up with theories and concepts for new forms of internationalisms between struggles, between movements, between grassroots structures. And this is what the Kurdish women's movement is also wanting to share with women around the world, that we need a transnational grassroots women's kind of bottom-up democracy structures for mutual kind of support, so that we no longer just when something bad happens that we write statements for each other and say we stand with you. Now is the time to really organize very powerful feminist, anti-militarist movements, ecological movements, and we believe really that this revolutionary energy that we're seeing in all the women's movements and strikes and marches around the world is something that is really, really, really explosive. And we must really protect the women's struggle from co-optation by the state and co-optation from capitalism. And I really believe that this kind of radical, direct, common struggle that we try to seek and that we also try to embody in our own struggle is really what's going to save the world. So in the perspective of the Kurdish women's movement, as mentioned in all of the statements that have recently been published, we are now in a time where we stand between femicide and women's struggle. It's either the women's revolution, which, as I said, again, it's not a sudden explosion of things, but it's something that we build in the here and now. With every autonomous structure that we build, with every new connection that we make between our movements, the women's revolution is growing. So in this sense, I think I'll stop here, and I'm really curious to hear what Lynn and you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilal, not only for making a lot of the important arguments for feminist internationalism, but also walking us through the history of the Kurdish women's movement. And you raise an important idea, right, of ideas of epistemology, basically how we know what we know, and how they're very closely linked to the idea of self-determination. And it's one that any political project has to contend with. And as an international, I think this is an important lesson in what we can learn about the power from the knowledge produced in revolutionary struggles. I want to turn to you, Lynn. You know, Dilal has brought to the table alternative forms of self-governance, whether it's the guerrilla camps in the mountains to kind of self-organized refugee camps. And you yourself have done a great deal of work on what it means to collectively care, to be collectively joyful. And you've talked about alternative ways of living together and looking after one another. So what do these alternatives of caring look like in a capitalist world where, say, care work, for instance, is otherwise monetized and exploited? But also if we consider the role of, say, the welfare state, which is actively under attack by authoritarian nationalists and governments and corporate empires, what does a caring state look like? So I want to turn to you now.
Right. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here talking on this global platform of the Progressive International. Thank you for inviting me, Vashna. And it's really so good to listen to Dala Dirik and to hear again how very, very important the Kurdish freedom movement has been and remains, especially for women, for feminism generally, but for all of us. So anyway, making the personal, political, and the intimate international, yes, that's what feminism at its best, not so much liberal feminism, but feminism at its best has always been about. And certainly in one way and another, it's what my activism and my writing has always been about, but never more so than recently. So before I can talk about all the good things that might come about, I have to say something about the world as it is. So I'm here because I have just written, I'm part of a group, the CARE Collective, which has just written a manifesto, the CARE Manifesto, which began by addressing the widespread crisis of care, which we've been looking at for some 3 years, because we know that both nationally and internationally, we've been facing a global crisis of care, long predating COVID, although COVID has just made everything a lot worse, almost everywhere. And so in our manifesto, we began by addressing this lack of care, or what we call a politics of carelessness at every level and engulfing the world. Well, almost everywhere, with the valiant acceptance of Rojava, where they've been trying very much to do things differently. But elsewhere, what we've been seeing is rising inequality almost everywhere, always inflected by racism and legacies of colonialism. We've seen endless war. We've seen a constant and growing refugee crisis. And then we've seen the rise of authoritarian reactionary states, which we'll be discussing today and hopefully continue discussing. And then looming over everything, ongoing climate crisis and environmental catastrophe. And yet, after all this gloom and despite all this gloom, I do also want to mention what things could be like if we were to put care front and center of our politics, if we were to begin from the recognition of our shared vulnerabilities and our global interdependencies. But right now, we're so very far from people overall sharing this vision. Although facing our multiple crises of care, that is not the way most people outside of Rahavia have been reacting to it. So let me begin by addressing that problem, a problem and a place where feminism has often begun. The fact that care itself has always been undervalued, even within our welfare states, which have been significantly undermined of late. And care has always been undervalued, both historically and still today. Care has always been undervalued, both historically and still today, because it's something that is associated with women. It's associated with women because it's been seen as the work that women do. It's been seen as women's sphere. So it's far from the first time that feminists have tried to place care at the heart of politics. But all this has been largely ignored. And yet what we feel is that in this moment of global crisis, in this moment of pandemic, perhaps something just might begin to shift. Care has been routinely marginalized as unproductive. Even on the left, real politics has tended to prioritize jobs and the economy. And yet, as feminists have always known, the economy relies upon the work of care, upon social reproduction, as Marxists say, all that enables people to survive, thrive, and reproduce themselves. Instead, however, what we've seen is governments trying to control women's bodies, and almost always the very first move of the authoritarian right governments we see today, whether in India, in Poland, Hungary, Turkey, is to institute further control over women's bodies, over women's reproductive rights. Even in the USA, this was a move which Trump continuously tried to bring about. So caring has always been gendered, but in today's long hours of paid work, neither women nor men have had much time to do any caring work. And this has resulted in a huge caring deficit, generating a global care chain, a chain of predominantly poor, immigrant and non-white women. Thus, racism combines with sexism and global inequality generally to devalue caring work further. Care work has also been undervalued and indeed often repudiated because of widespread contempt and devaluation of so-called dependency. Symbolic manhood was always seen as the very antithesis of dependency. Now, you'd think this old gender cliche might have disappeared long ago, but for the last 4 decades, neoliberal exaltation of wholly misleading notions of individual resilience, autonomy, and choice has actually deepened the disavowal of human fragility, dependence, and need for care. So the ideal citizen today, male or female, must be entrepreneurial, resilient, and self-sufficient. Indeed, the pathologizing of dependency help justify the dismantling of welfare states, the dismantling of benefits, the selling off of public resources, which we've been seeing in Britain ever since Margaret Thatcher, and which we've been seeing around the world whenever neoliberal ideology and rationality comes to the fore. But yet another reason for the marginalizing of care is that it can be very challenging work, and this is sometimes overlooked. Indeed, the concept of care overflows with paradoxes and ambivalence, often generating conflicting emotions, which are rarely given due respect or attention. For attending fully to the needs of any living creature any living things is confronting vulnerability. And this can be troubling and exhausting, something many people don't want to be engaged in. Hands-on caring, however rewarding then, can also be daunting, bringing us into contact with our own and others' mortal embodied selves. So this is also why caring work has traditionally been relegated to the realm of women or servants, deemed inferior, indeed deemed inferior because this is the work that they are doing, and thereby enabling others to disavow thoughts of their own inescapable vulnerabilities and their inevitable mortality. So this takes me back again to neoliberalism, the decline of those welfare states, and the marketizing and outsourcing of public provision today, which has had such catastrophic consequences in so many countries, and beginning especially in Britain, where we've seen a looming care crisis across every stage of life. Parents without time to care for their children, the withdrawal of resources for adolescents just when teenage knife crimes and other things are escalating, and so on, down the board to a complete crisis in social care, where about 1 million people in the UK are without the social care that they need. And this is because public care provision has become increasingly inaccessible to so many, with services outsourced to corporate commodity chains. Privatized care often creates intolerable conditions, both for workers and those being cared for. It creates insecure, underpaid, 0 hours contracts, curtailing the continuity of jobs, the continuity of caring. So while massive profits have been made from outsourced care, the resulting provision often mocks the very name of care, with little security for either those being cared for or for the carers. Neglect by design is how some have described this situation, which anyone with elder relatives knows so well. For there is something special about care and caring logics which make them incompatible with market logics. Care requires time, flexibility, patience, and imagination, all the things that have never been valued, never been seen or given the importance that they have. And further, the challenges of care and anxieties over doing it well or even adequately can easily fuel resentment in caring relationships. Thus, both positive and negative emotions often entwine with our capacities to care, which is not so surprising given that caring work is also so undervalued. So it's precisely because of the complexity and challenges of care that we need to fight to ensure all the necessary social infrastructures that assist us in caring for others, that will give us time off, that will let us know we have the resources and we have the time to care well, and to care well not just for our immediate relatives, or neighbours, our communities, but to care for the condition of the world itself. But instead, pressures of today's job markets routinely mean people barely have time even to care for themselves. Certainly, they find it hard caring for the essential needs of their own dependents, let alone do they have time to pay heed to or do anything about the situation of others further afield. So more time and adequate material resources, but also rethinking the very nature of care, making a more expansive language of care is crucial if we're ever going to adopt more imaginative practices of care, not just at national, but at global levels. For we also need to ensure that we all live in a sustainable world, the very opposite of what we've been witnessing in today's turbocharged capitalist world. So any sustainable future means that we have to break once and for all that supposed binary between dependence and independence, the strong and the weak, recognizing, as I said at the start, that we're all formed in different ways in and through, and only in and through, our interdependencies, our relations to others, our relation to the world itself, in ways, of course, always inflected by class and race and legacies of colonialism, which will always render some people much more vulnerable than others. But we're all vulnerable, we're all fragile, but some people are rendered even more so. Because the truth is, we always need others from cradle to grave, and we can only provide adequate care with caring communities, with adequate infrastructures that we can rely upon, just the sorts of infrastructures that have been outsourced and crumbling in Britain and so many other places. So we need caring communities, but they need to be part of a caring, sustainable world if we are not to be giving ground to the right, who always rely upon demonizing all those they see as more vulnerable, as dependent, more dependent than themselves, whether near or far. Those many globally who remain more impoverished, so often in one way or another, whom the wealthier nations have helped to impoverish. Thus, reimagining a caring politics, which is what we're trying to do in the Care Manifesto, is reimagining a global politics and developing new languages and notions of care, which is why in the manifesto we speak of the need for universal care, for care being placed front and center of everything, for all institutions themselves also being caring. So we need both to recognize that we all depend upon others in a sustainable world, but also to notice the ambivalence that this can generate, that many people want to deny it, leading us to repudiate our own actual dependencies. And of course, it also means absolutely fully valuing the skills and resources necessary to promote care in all its manifestations, which is something many feminists have been trying to do in talking about an ethics of care, in stressing the importance of care generally, and also in calling for the degendering of care, which also needs to be a deracing of care until we all become, in some sense, caregivers as well as care receivers. For we all need both to give and to receive care to sustain any sense of our common humanity. And only in this way can we confront our own shared fears of human frailty that we so often try to suppress, why people are so frightened of aging, frightened of so many things that they fear might weaken them, rather than project those fears onto those that we label as dependent, as needy, more needy than us. For this is the very seedbed of the right, as they set out to divide and rule, and also as they set out to control women's bodies, to try and keep us in that role of the unpaid, unvalued caregivers. So it's time to change all that. It's time to change all that if we're to have any viable and sustainable future at all, I'd say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn, I feel like we've heard your manifesto now and we're inspired to indeed change all of that. But thank you for that summary of, care in politics, not just care work as we conventionally understand it, but in public provision, care in governance, and importantly, distinguishing between exploitative care and caring well. I want to turn to Dilar now, because an interesting theme that I've heard in both of your speeches, Lynn and Dilar, is this relationship between independence and interdependence, right? And both are meant to be empowering in some sense. We do want to be interdependent. We do want to be dependent on each other, and to have the sense of community without getting into exploitative networks. But as we envision the world we want to build, how do you see this play out? And let's get into the specifics here a little bit. I want to ask you, Dilar, about organizing across borders, organizing across generations, right? A comrade once said to me, we do things in revolutionary movements for ideology, yes, but often because we come to love each other so, and we push ourselves in ways we didn't think was possible for our friends. And political alliances are built on these kind of shared feelings. But it seemingly gets challenging to build these alliances with geopolitical distance, even in today's digital age. And the recent protests, say for George Floyd, I think suggest an opening that we can indeed feel implicated in each other's oppression and not just intellectually know or acknowledge something is wrong, but emotionally be outraged for one another. But over time, how do you build that kind of solidarity into political organizations? You say we have to move beyond solidarity, and I'd love to hear more about that, right? Both from your ethnographic work in the Kurdish women's movement, what lessons do you have for organizing for internationalists who find themselves in a world filled with NGOized models around, social issues? But also more generally, what do you think the women's movements around the world have to offer to internationalism?
Thank you. These are very important, very, very, very crucial questions. And I would also like to thank Lynn for her amazing and thought-provoking contribution. I think at the very heart of revolutionary or internationalist feminist organizing needs to be a sincere and genuine belief that society can change. I think many times, and this is unfortunately something that we see among many social movements and progressive circles, is this kind of very quick giving up on people, or giving up on causes, giving up on somebody because of their politics. And I think at this stage, this is really not something that anyone, no matter how they define themselves, can afford in the face of this rise of right-wing fascism, which kill not only entire communities on a daily basis, but also nature, and women are always particularly impacted by this. So the right-wing nationalism is, as you also said at the very beginning, and referring to what's happening in India at the moment, it's so important to understand the links between these things. And I think for example, the Kurdish women's movement developed, and oftentimes people describe it as an inspiration, when actually it's not something that is a magical thing, and it's not something that is specific to Kurdish people or culture, that there is a strong women's movement. It's 40 years of revolutionary organizing, full of struggle, full of sacrifice, full of women being killed. And so many women, as I mentioned, thousands of them are in prison at the moment in Turkey because they are feminists, because they are organizing for women's liberation. And so what we need to do in terms of women's struggles and try to understand these links is that, first of all, as I mentioned earlier as well, beginning with our own communities is to know that actually we can have a free society, we can have different social relations. that oppression and also violence against women, for example, which is a big issue in Kurdistan and in the region in general, it's used also as a weapon in war. We've seen like thousands of women being kidnapped and raped and sold into slavery by groups like ISIS. And today, it is a NATO army that sponsors similar groups, and they're targeting Kurdish women activists on a daily basis in Rojava. So what that means is we need to start, first of all, eradicating this patriarchal mentality and the idea that violence against women is just part of nature, and women and men are just inherently violent. So this is our approach, is that unlike, you know, some groups, quite easily, I think they give up by saying it's not my job to educate the men or something. We don't believe that. If we want to exclude all the violent men in our communities, we will not have a movement. And so that's, of course, that means women, again, as Lynn said, have to do this double and extra work. But we give ourselves this mission, and we actually organize in these autonomous structures also to protect ourselves, to actually have spaces in which we are just amongst ourselves, where we develop ways in which in the general movement we can represent the collective willpower of the women's movement, that we take our decisions on our own behalf, but with the aim of changing our society in general. So when we say autonomy, when we're speaking about the Kurdish women's movement and its autonomous women's structures, they're not just to separate ourselves from the men. They're not just to have free and kind of safe spaces for us. We need those free and safe spaces, yes, also for our well-being, but above all, in order for us to have a much more strong and kind of programmatic approach to how we change the man. So like this sentence, killing the man or transforming the man, is something we really mean, because as Öcalan also said very early on in the struggle, there cannot be revolution with enslaved women or dominant men. Both need to change. There needs to be a change in this internalized sexism. There needs to be a reformulation of women, friendship between women, solidarity between women, and to protect ourselves also from patriarchal attacks by men who struggle with us in common causes. But we need to also give ourselves the mission that we also are the transformative force. Like, we consider the women's movement in Kurdistan as the radical left wing of the Kurdish freedom struggle. So this is a kind of revolutionary subjectivity that we give, especially to the youth and to women. And young women have a specific role to play in this, because they are suffering from these different types of oppression. And I think this really relates to the question of care and interdependency. So whilst people, as I mentioned earlier, they often describe what's happening in Rojava, and rightfully so, because there have been very important historical achievements. Also, in general, what's going on in Kurdistan is really important. It's an outcome of so many women's labor. But at this moment, it needs protection from other women, you know. So how can other women's movements relate to what's going on there? And I think this really happens the more we think about the connections between patriarchal violence and state violence, for example. State violence and militarism and sexism, they often mirror each other in so many striking ways. And we see this so very clearly articulated in the ways in which the Turkish state is currently attacking the Kurdish women's movement. Because Kurdish women became a symbol against fascism embodied in ISIS in the last few years, now they're specifically targeting women, specifically assassinating women leaders, specifically imprisoning women, specifically targeting women with drones. And also many women fighters have been specifically targeted and filmed stripped naked. I mean, it's really, really clear that the Turkish state and its proxies are targeting Kurdish women in order to destroy what Rojava stands for. And I think Rojava stands also for this kind of alternative for the Middle East, that people should not be forced between imperialist kind of domination of the region, or just backwardness and kind of conservatism and authoritarianism. There are alternatives, and people, if they're given the chance to build them, they will do it. So I think at the very heart of any kind of women's organizing, feminist organizing, and internationalism needs to be this kind of principle of hope, that things can change, but that they need to basically be mutually kind of dependent. And I think, as I mentioned, people sometimes ask the question, will Rojava survive? What's going on? Will the attacks continue? Yes, the attacks are continuing right now. We are really very much expecting another Turkish invasion. So I'm sorry, I come across as a bit kind of, negative, but the situation is really bad. The Turkish army is bombarding refugee camps without anybody saying anything. So what does it mean then? Is that we have now launched a campaign called 100 Reasons to prosecute Erdogan for femicide. And with this campaign, the Kurdish women's movement is not just focusing on the women that were killed by the Turkish state in Kurdistan, but to make this connection between socially normalized femicide and political femicide, and to say, actually, we want for all women in the world to get femicide to be recognized internationally as a crime against humanity. So that femicide, wherever it happens, not just in Kurdistan, is seen as one of the biggest things that we need to struggle against, because it relates to colonialism, it relates to the environmental activism, it relates to so many other things. And in this way, I really think only by really being able to see one person or one movement, one community struggle as my own, we can really fully humanize ourselves. Because, I mean, the Kurdish people, for example, they're not always, I don't just see myself as a Kurdish woman. I know we have so many more complex kind of personalities and ability. We should be able to express our full humanity, but we can't under these conditions of war and occupation. And I think this is why it's so important that especially movements that have more resources, that have more kind of access to bigger platforms, need to really use their resources also to amplify struggles in the global south, struggles of indigenous communities, struggles of marginalized communities. And I think this is exactly what we need to do when saying struggling against fascism in Europe, especially, needs to also be a struggle against the arms trade. There is an increasing movement to divest from fossil fuels. There needs to be also divestment from the arms trade on all levels, and new technologies and these kinds of things. So the list goes on, of course, but at the bottom of, from the bottom of our hearts, and you will see this in the movement statements, is really this belief that the women's movement is the force of the 21st century, that it is the one that has because it embodies so many contradictions and so many different battlefronts, it will be the main force for social transformation, because patriarchy is the deepest, most intimate form of oppression, and we experience it and normalize it on a daily basis. Every single woman has had an experience with this kind of violence and sexism and so on. So we have actually very intimate experiences with different types of oppression and basically patriarchal fascism in our own families. So what can we add to, rather than just being additions to ongoing progressive struggles? How can we drag other struggles with us and say no struggle will succeed unless it's also a feminist one?
Thank you, Dila. And certainly what I heard from your speech was this principle of hope, right? The women's movement is definitely the force of the 21st century. And I think you referred to revolutionary energy early on in your speech. And that's something that I definitely hear from your words. So, solidarity to you and everyone else in working in the movement at the moment. And a lot of the idea of intimacy, the idea of being able to depend on each other, the idea of the solidarity that you spoke of, then you've written about this in terms of very specific alternatives in which communities have been doing this, right? You spoke of a care crisis, and it seems that part of that is linked to the decline of the welfare state. To what extent do you think the state can still be involved in this renewed politics of care that you spoke about? But to go more specific, are there alternative ways forward that we might rely on that don't depend, that are non-state infrastructures?
Right. Okay. But let me just begin by saying I do agree with Dala that solidarity is everything. And the global women's strike movement has also been crucial, perhaps one of the leading global, or rather the leading radical politics of the moment. But I don't want to pose the state against mutual aid and all the other grassroots progressive forms of caring, which we've seen growing and have had to grow throughout this pandemic. So the first thing that happened when the pandemic hit, and when in Britain, for instance, our hospitals were 100,000 short of doctors and nurses because of all the prior cuts, when we were slow to lock down, we were slow in every way to get things moving, to stop COVID-19 coming here, and to get resources for people to survive, then mutual aid groups were set up, which remain very, very important. We already had them. We had food banks everywhere because of the effects of austerity over the last 10 years. And we've had over a decade of Tory rule here that's been committed, not just to neoliberal politics of putting the market first everywhere, but to making cuts everywhere. And so mutual aid has been crucial. The food banks have been crucial, and all around me, much of the time, the people I know are involved in this collecting food, taking it to the food banks. But of course, this is something we want to see ended, and we only see it ended once we start to get some, what we see ourselves trying to begin from municipal socialism. You don't have to be in the Labour Party, for instance, which is the only party that has any hope of trying to put forward more progressive policies, especially locally, to try and insource all those outsourced resources, to take our caring facilities back from those terrible global corporations that are making care workers work faster and faster and attend less and less to those they're caring for. All that has to be turned around, and that also has to be happening at state level. I mean, there's no other way that we can improve those basic infrastructures we all rely upon. So I'm talking about healthcare, education, transport, buildings, public parks, libraries, all that enables everybody to have a more creative life. And as well, we need legislation for shorter working time. We can't possibly have anything like a caring world, a feminist world, if everybody is out there working all hours around the clock, usually doing completely useless or bullshit jobs. We have to be working less in paid work. So we need both shorter working week, which we have a lot of different NGOs campaigning for that here. And we also need to be together in a grassroots way, building those shared resources we need, not just libraries for lending, but the lending of things, the sharing of the goods we need for a good life. And the way in which that connects with my previous work, my last book was called Radical Happiness, Moments of Collective Joy. And one thing I was saying, which of course will know so well in Rahavia, is, in the best of times when we can see our struggles getting somewhere, they are moments of real collective joy. And I got the notion of radical happiness actually from that wonderful poet Adrienne Rich, who sadly died a few years ago, in which she talked about when she could really enjoy sharing her poetry with others. For instance, when she was in Chile with the fall of Pinochet, or at the beginning of the alternative global, anti-capitalist global movements and so on, when we can be together feeling that at least we're working, for some goal that's going to make things better, they're often moments of real joy. But of course, there's also the tedium of just continuing to struggle, continuing to do all the necessary solidarity work. That's why I was talking about the ambivalences of care. We'll never live just in a perfect world, a utopian world that is all the time giving us the milk and honey we need. Well, there'll always have to be moments of struggle, but I actually think any forms of collectivity give life greater meaning. It's interesting how we hear so much today about loneliness, not just solitude, but real loneliness. And I think that comes from people having no real sense that their lives are meaningful, that their lives connect with others. And as soon as we start connecting with others, which often, and particularly for women, includes fighting violence against women, often women escaping, from those enclosed familial places they've been, to join with other women in fighting violence, taking to the streets. You see, the immense joy that has been there in those movements against violence. And I've seen them in India. I've seen them everywhere, you know, even sex workers and slut walks and, you know, just women saying, no, we're taking control now. Any sense that we're taking control always makes you feel empowered. And when things go well, makes you feel really good. And when they're not going well, then we have to work out how we reach out to each other to try and say, look, things can change. Things can change. They have changed, even at the worst of times. And, you know, they're not very good times in most places now. But, you know, all the people I know who are surviving them in the best way possible are doing that because they're reaching out more. Sometimes they have more time to reach out more because they've been furloughed or they're not working these endless long hours in jobs they don't find particularly meaningful. And so everyone who's been able to do that work of reaching out, of thinking of others, I think, has been able to get some sense that, yes, it's okay to be alive. It's okay, even in bad times, to be alive and to hope for better times.
Thank you for that, Lynn. Thank you also for reminding us of what joy it is to be able to work with incredible feminist comrades like you all, and to be able to sit in a virtual room together. I remember just before we came on, the three of us were talking, and Dilar said, you know, I hope we get a chance to meet someday actually in person. And at any other point in time, we would be meeting in, you know, public squares or plazas, with the joy of taking over public space. For what it's worth, platforms like Twitter and Facebook are the closest thing we have to an international public space. And part of the Internationalist as a show is our attempt to use that and to reclaim more and more of these platforms as public spaces, and to get these kind of voices out there. So huge thank you to both of you, our guests, and to our audience, who I see have joined us live from across the globe. Thank you for being here and sharing our work, and I hope you've enjoyed our discussion. The Internationalists will be back next week on 10th December. On the occasion of the International Human Rights Day, we will return with the second session of the Belmarsh Tribunal, demanding the release of Julian Assange as the COVID-19 pandemic escalates at Belmarsh Prison. If you like what we do, I invite you to join us. Please become a member of Progressive International, and a reminder that you can support our work on progressive.international. Just $5 a month will help us continue to build this planetary alliance of progressive forces, and perhaps, as we've discussed today, also build an intimate internationalism. Thank you so much, and see you next week.
Thank you.